We no longer hear a lot of mumbling about the domino theory that led America to lose more than 50,000 of its young in that war, and to unleash on a very small country 3 times the total firepower spent by all combatants on all sides in both the European and the Asian theater in World War II. It's politically correct even today to mention this, but we killed 10% of the total population of Vietnam. Back in the Roman Empire, that was called decimation. Like many in my generation, I was looking for, but not finding, something that would make sense of what seemed to me to be going so terribly wrong, that would help me understand the root causes. And if you can understand the root causes, then figure out how you can correct them. Stop feeling so confused and impotent. So I dropped out. I have had sort of a history of dropping out of things. I dropped out and spent 3 years hitchhiking all over the world. I went down the west coast of Africa and up the east coast. I took the Trans-Siberian Railway across Russia in December. That was still a Dr. Zhivago sort of adventure in 1965. I hiked all over places like Iraq and Iran, Sudan, Egypt, Syria, things that would be completely unthinkable in today's world. I witnessed firsthand the grotesque, sterile ugliness of life under Marxism. In Czechoslovakia, where my maternal grandparents came from, the land was so utterly ravaged in some places that I could walk for miles, say, in the Sudetenland, without so much as encountering, and you're not going to believe this, but it is the honest-to-God truth, without so much as encountering a blade of grass. There was so much sulfur coming out of so many plants that nothing green lived in its plume. I hiked through dozens of former colonies in search of Frantz Fanon's new revolutionary man, but what I found was mostly chaos and poverty and violence and corruption. I spent some time studying Zen Buddhism in Japan, but found no enlightenment. I purchased an utterly incomprehensible book, ostensibly authored by Mao when I was visiting Macau, and I gave up and threw it away when I got back to Hong Kong. I observed capitalism in its purest, unregulated form in South Korea. It's a bit like Shenzhen, China today, or perhaps one of the Russian oil towns. And I didn't find what I was looking for. But one night, lying by myself without a tent in the middle of the Namib Desert in southwest Africa, for reasons that I can't begin to explain, I thought back to that ecology institute that I'd been in high school, and I had what seemed to me at the time to be a brilliant flash of insight. We had studied all of these principles of ecology that explained how the world was ordered and how creatures related to the world and to their individual environments. And those principles governed the activities of everything. I'd spent that summer studying dragonflies, but it applied to elk and to bullfrogs. And it occurred to me to monkeys, gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees. And maybe it made sense to apply it to that final kind of primate as well, that perhaps human beings ought to try to start building with nature instead of constantly trying to fight nature. I didn't have a vocabulary for most of what I was talking about, but today we would talk about it as urban ecology and industrial ecology. Where humans get most of our energy from stocks, from oil and gas and coal and uranium, every other animal on the planet depends on natural flows of energy, with the exception of some bacteria that live off of thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. But everything else depends upon flows of energy from the sun, mostly energy that has been captured by plants through photosynthesis and then later released through oxidative phosphorylation, which gives power to everything from your neurons to the contraction of muscles. All work that is done by animals is through the same basic process. I certainly had no clue that night that I would later marry the daughter of a BYU graduate who went on to win a Nobel Prize for describing the mechanism that underpins oxidative phosphorylation. But I somehow had a sense that this set of relationships was going to be important to me. I arose the following morning basically knowing what I wanted to do with my life. Essentially, every decision that I've made since then about my education, about dropping out of law school to organize the first Earth Day, about dropping out of my law firm to organize the first international one in 1990, of my employment, my diet, my choosing to have just one child, my automobile, all flowed organically from that night in Namibia, before the nation of Namibia even existed, when I became an environmentalist, before the word environmentalist existed. In my somewhat expansive view, environmentalism has important insights to offer, not just on the proper management of forests and fisheries and sewage treatment facilities, but also to macroeconomic policy and nutrition and urban and industrial design and foreign affairs and healthy housing and energy and transportation. And interestingly, all of those fields played a fairly prominent role in the first Earth Day. They were all strands that we were trying to weave together into the fabric of a new way of viewing the world and a new vocabulary to speak of that way. The 5-year environmental golden age from 1970 through 1974 arguably saw a wider array of far-reaching legislation adopted with strong bipartisan support than any other period since Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first term. And environmentalists didn't have a wildly popular president to lead our effort. Indeed, we prided ourselves on being citizen-led. There's the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Environmental Education Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the defeat of the supersonic transport, the creation of the EPA and the President's Council on Environmental Quality, and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in 5 years. Since then, we've probably spent a few $1 trillion differently than we would have if it had not been for those things that fundamentally changed many of the ground rules of business and urban planning and life. It was a very heady period. And perhaps even more profoundly, the right to a safe, healthy environment, a concept that essentially didn't exist before 1970. I mean, I grew up in a paper mill community that had no controls whatsoever on its emissions of sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide. So every morning for the first 18 years of my life, I woke up with a sore throat. We knew that this stuff pitted the paint on our automobiles, and we persuaded the mill to actually put together a shower so at the end of the shift people could drive through the shower and hose off their automobiles. But not only did it not occur to us that that stuff that was pitting our automobiles might not be entirely good for our lungs, we took a sort of a perverse pride in it. We were tough enough to handle this. This was the smell of progress. This was the smell of prosperity. But in 1970, there arose this concept of a right to a safe, healthy environment, a right that now has become a more fundamental American core value, possessing wider, deeper public support than some of the values enshrined in the Bill of Rights. In the derision that American commentators applied to China's environment in recent months, they forgot that Gary, Indiana, had far worse air in 1969 than Beijing has today, even though America was a whole lot richer then than China. An interesting question. Does anybody here know where the worst air in the world is?
Salt Lake City.
Not even close. But neither Houston nor Los Angeles are in there either, nor actually, if you get to it, Mexico City or Sao Paulo or any of those cities in China. The worst air that I've ever experienced was in a peasant's hut. A guy who was entirely off the cash economy in Western China, burned dung for energy, didn't have a stove, just did an open fire in the middle of the hut, didn't even have, not only not a chimney, but not even a hole in the roof of the hut. You cannot imagine, I mean, it's perfectly understandable why life expectancies in part of the country are under 40. I wasn't sure I was going to get out of the hut that afternoon alive. Bad air can be really bad air. Interestingly, and this might be important, in 1969, when we began organizing the first Earth Day for 1970, American politics was in complete turmoil. America was enmeshed in a deeply unpopular war in Vietnam, and death rates were escalating, and the invasion of another country, Cambodia, was imminent. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, this is very strange. So I can see better without, hallelujah, something has happened to my eyes. I see better without my glasses. I'm going to stay here in Salt Lake City. I'm hoping it will do something for my legs too and my endurance.